Hi everyone, this is lecture 10, the autonomic nervous system. You already know a lot about the autonomic nervous system because in SCB 203 you saw how it controlled the respiratory system as well as the heart. And at the beginning of this semester we discussed the outline of the nervous system, and we described one part of the nervous system that was involuntary was the autonomic nervous system. So now we're going to devote an entire lecture on this topic. And in this lecture, we're going to review a little bit from what we did before and look at the difference between the somatic, autonomic, and something new called the enteric nervous system, the peripheral nervous system. The enteric nervous system, we're just going to just briefly mention. We'll talk more about it when we get to the digestive system. Okay. We'll then look at the structural and functional features of the autonomic nervous system. Make sure you pay attention to the structural differences because this aspect is usually not covered in the laboratory. We're going to be able to compare and contrast the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. And we'll briefly mention what dual innervation is. Okay. And then we'll compare and contrast the preganglionic and postganglionic neurotransmitters between the two systems. And we'll talk about the different kind of receptors, cholinergic and adrenergic receptors. Name a few. So let's review the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. Okay. Recall both are branches of the motor or efferent division of the nervous system. Okay, and we saw this figure on the very first day of class showing that the motor efferent division is divided into the somatic motor division, which carries signals to skeletal muscles, and also the autonomic nervous system, which carries signals to the smooth muscle, cardiac muscles, and glands. Okay. Now, just like reflexes, we can create reflex arcs showing the functions of the autonomic and visceral nervous system. And both these control vital bodily functions. Okay. So briefly, this is just the scheme of a reflex arc of the involuntary nervous system. Okay. So first, there are sensory signals that arise from the viscera, the skin, and sent by an afferent sensory neuron to the brain. Okay, so right here. The stimuli are integrated by the central nervous system, usually somewhere in the brainstem. And then the motor impulses from the central nervous system are sent via efferent sensory neurons to cranial and spinal nerves to the autonomic ganglia. Okay. And notice something special here. Here we have a synapse here in what's called the autonomic ganglia, and then that extends to the visceral organ. Okay. So the motor impulses from the central nervous system are sent via afferent sensory neurons to cranial and spinal nerves to this autonomic ganglia. Then the autonomic ganglia sends the impulses via other efferent neurons to various target organs where they trigger a motor response in the target cells. So here's a reflex arc of the autonomic nervous system. Okay, now let's compare the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. One major difference between the two is that the somatic nervous system has one neuron, while the autonomic nervous system has two neurons. Okay, that's one major difference. Let's take a look. Okay, here's the somatic nervous system. Okay, from the spinal cord, we have one neuron that synapses to a muscle cell. Okay, and you learned this in SCB 203 because here's the neuromuscular junction that will stimulate excitation, contraction, coupling of skeletal muscle. Okay, but here in the somatic nervous system we have one neuron. Okay, what else can we say about it? The target is skeletal muscle fibers, and this is voluntary because we have conscious control over it. Now let's take a look at the autonomic nervous system. Okay, here we have two neurons, and here's the autonomic ganglion, which we mentioned in the previous figure. Okay, right here. So since there's a synapse here, we usually call one preganglionic, the one right before it, and we usually say the one right after it postganglionic. And what can we say about the autonomic nervous system? Well, first of all, there are two neurons, and their targets are smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. Okay, and they're involuntary. Okay. So there are several distinct differences between the somatic motor and the autonomic nervous system. Okay. And we mentioned here that the two neurons are distinguished as preganglionic, before the ganglion, and postganglionic, or after the synapse here. And neurotransmitter may include both acetylcholine and norepinephrine. If you recall from the somatic motor system, it only involved acetylcholine. Okay. So here's the comparison of the two together. Again, the somatic nervous system has one neuron, and the autonomic nervous system has two neurons. Okay. And of course, here we have the autonomic ganglion here. So we have a preganglionic and postganglion neuron. Okay. The target cells for somatic nervous system is skeletal muscles. The targets for the autonomic nervous system are smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or gland. The somatic nervous system is voluntary, where the autonomic nervous system is involuntary. Okay. There's one additional unique feature or difference between the two. Look at the somatic, the axon of the somatic nervous system. Here, it has a myelin sheath. But if you look here, in the autonomic nervous system, they're not myelinated. So the conduction velocity would be anticipated to be slower than for muscle contraction. So I like this figure because there's so much information obtained from this simple basic figure here. Okay. Now that we know the differences between the somatic and the autonomic nervous system, let's look at the divisions of the autonomic nervous system and how they are different. So the autonomic nervous system is separated into the parasympathetic, sympathetic, and the enteric nervous systems. Okay, since we'll cover the digestive system later, we'll do the enteric nervous system first, and we won't say too much about it. The enteric nervous system contains nerves of the autonomic nervous system that extends from the esophagus to the anus, and they're responsible for reflexes and motility of the digestive system. So they're kind of very specialized part of the autonomic nervous system. The rest of our discussion now is going to be completely focused on the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, which you probably heard before in SCB 203. So here we have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Since they're both part of the autonomic nervous system, they both contain two neurons extending from the spinal cord. But there are many differences between the two. Okay. Let's take a look at the sympathetic nervous system first. Notice here that they extend from the thoracic and lumbar regions of the spinal cord. Okay. Of course, there's a preganglionic and postganglionic neuron, but take a look at the length of the axons between the preganglionic neuron and the postganglionic neuron. The preganglionic neuron is so very short, and the postganglionic neuron axon is very long. Okay. Let's compare this to the parasympathetic nervous system. Again, we have two neurons, a preganglionic and a postganglionic neuron, but these extend from the brainstem or the sacral spinal cord, so they're the more extremes of the nervous system. And let's take a look at the lengths of the axons. Here in the parasympathetic nervous system, we have a long preganglionic axon and a very short postganglionic axon. Okay. So again, this is a very informative figure because it describes many differences between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Okay. So to review, the sympathetic preganglionic axons are short, and the postganglionic axons are long. However, the parasympathetic preganglionic axons are long, and the postganglionic fibers are short. Okay. So we could look at this figure again, and we can see it's sympathetic. Preganglionic short, postganglionic long. Parasympathetic, preganglionic long, postganglionic short. Okay. Now we said another difference between the two is where they originate. So the cell bodies of the preganglionic sympathetic neurons originate from the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord. However, the cell bodies of the preganglionic parasympathetic neurons originate in the cranial nerves of the brainstem and the sacral spinal cord. So these are at the extreme ends, whereas the sympathetic is sort of in the middle. Okay, and so to illustrate this, here we show the difference between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. So we said that the sympathetic nervous system extends from the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord here, and the parasympathetic extends from the brainstem and the sacral spinal cord. Okay. And you can also see the illustration of the length of the axons between the two as well. Okay. Now, you probably learned this description of the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. That the sympathetic is known as the fight or flight division of the autonomic nervous system, and the parasympathetic is known as the rest and digest division of the autonomic nervous system. Okay. So, for example, digestion is going to be controlled by the parasympathetic nervous system, whereas increase in heart rate and force of contraction, if someone's chasing after you, will be involved in this from the sympathetic system. Okay. Now let's talk about the gross anatomy of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, this is not covered in the lab, so you might want to know this. This is the only probably opportunity you'll hear this. Okay. Now the sympathetic nervous system is kind of interesting because the cell bodies are alongside the vertebral column. Okay, and because of this, they're called the sympathetic chain ganglia due to their chain-like appearance. So let's take a look at this. So here are the sympathetic chain ganglia on either side of the vertebral column. And so these are the sympathetic ganglia, which we mentioned, where the presynaptic or preganglionic neurons synapse with the postganglionic. Okay. Oh, remember our definition of a ganglion. Okay, a ganglion is a group of cell bodies in the peripheral nervous system. Okay, that we learned in the first day class. So let's look at the gross anatomy of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay. So we have a preganglionic neuron that originates in the lateral horns of the thoracic and lumbar spinal cord. Okay, so if you remember the lateral horns are involved in the sympathetic nervous system. So here is the preganglionic neuron cell body here in the lateral horn. Okay, and it extends out to the anterior root. Okay, and they exit the spinal cord via the anterior root. Okay, here's the anterior root. Okay, then the axons extend to form nerves called the white ramus communicans. So after they extend to a spinal nerve, they branch off to form the white ramus communicans here. Okay, then these enter the sympathetic chain ganglia. See this swelling right here? This swelling here is one of the sympathetic chain ganglia, where it will form a synapse with. Okay. Now from here, there are three different pathways it can take. Okay, it can synapse and it can stay in the same sympathetic chain ganglia. It could go to a different sympathetic chain ganglia, or it could go to the collateral ganglia. So there are three pathways for sympathetic neurons. Okay. The preganglionic neurons may synapse on cell bodies of the postganglionic neurons in the same sympathetic chain ganglia. So this is the first option. The postganglionic neurons exit the ganglia as small gray rami communicans. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Okay, so they come and into the sympathetic chain ganglia, and the axon synapses of the postganglionic neuron in the same sympathetic chain ganglia. Okay. Right here. And they exit the spinal nerve to the target cell. Now, another option is that preganglionic neurons may ascend, or move up, or descend, or go down, and synapse on cell bodies of a postganglionic neuron in different sympathetic chain ganglia. Okay, and then they exit the ganglia as a small gray rami communicans. Okay, so here we see that from here it will synapse with a postganglion neuron and ascend or descend. Here it's ascending up, and will synapse with a postganglionic neuron in a different chain ganglia. Okay, that's the second option. The last option is that some preganglionic neurons may synapse on collateral ganglia located near the target organ. So here the ganglia is not in with the sympathetic chain ganglia. So here's a third option, where it extends out, it leaves the sympathetic chain ganglia and synapses with a postganglionic neuron in a collateral ganglia closer to the target cells. So these are the three different options that the postganglionic neuron can take. Now, the preganglionic axon that synapses on collateral ganglia near the abdominal pulvicular are called splanchnic nerves. Okay, so here are the axons of the splanchnic nerves. Okay, now let's take a look at the sympathetic neurotransmitters and the receptors. Okay, so remember, a neurotransmitter interacts with target cells by binding to an integral protein receptor. Okay, and we have different classes of sympathetic neurotransmitters. Okay. Preganglionic axons communicate with postganglionic neurons using acetylcholine. Okay, so this is easy because you want it. And this figure is not from your textbook, but it's from the 6th edition of Saladin, which we used many years ago. I like these figures because they're simple and they're not found in your textbook. Okay, so here at the bottom ones are the pink, refer to the sympathetic nervous system. We'll go to the top one later. That's the parasympathetic. But you can see here that the acetylcholine is released from the presynaptic or preganglionic neuron. Okay, and they bind to nicotinic receptors. Okay, so this is kind of nice because there's no choice. It's going to be acetylcholine and nicotinic receptors, and the receptors are on the postganglionic neuron. Okay, but we have a different story with the postganglionic axons because they can release norepinephrine, also known as noradrenaline, epinephrine or adrenaline, or acetylcholine. So, as you might expect, epinephrine and norepinephrine are very similar in structure, with only one methyl group that's different. Okay, so usually receptors won't differentiate between them; they'll bind to both. And then, of course, you could also have acetylcholine also released as at the postganglionic axon. Okay, so here in the postganglionic axon, We could have norepinephrine or epinephrine being released, and these bind to adrenergic receptors. Or we could have acetylcholine being released. But here we have a different type of receptor. This receptor is called a muscarinic receptor. Okay. Many of these receptors are named after the ligands that were used to find that bound to them. So, for example, nicotinic receptors bound to nicotine, and muscarinic receptors binds the toxin muscarine. Okay, and adrenergic receptors bind things like norepinephrine, epinephrine. Now, if the postganglionic axon releases norepinephrine or epinephrine, then it's an adrenergic fiber with adrenergic receptors. If the postganglionic axon releases acetylcholine, then it's a cholinergic fiber with muscarinic receptors. Okay? And cholinergic is referring to acetylcholine. Okay? Okay, so again, the postganglionic axon secretes norepinephrine or epinephrine. They bind adrenergic receptors, and these are called adrenergic fibers. The postganglionic neuron secretes acetylcholine, and it's called a cholinergic fiber, and binds to muscarinic receptors. Okay, so let's go into more detail about the different types of sympathetic receptors. So we mentioned adrenergic and we mentioned cholinergic receptors. Okay, so those that bind norepinephrine or epinephrine are called adrenergic receptors, and those that bind acetylcholine are cholinergic receptors. Okay, adrenergic receptors have many subtypes. Okay, and the major ones are called alpha receptors and beta receptors. Okay, and among these, there are also subtypes of alpha and beta receptors. So I'm just going to give you a few. There's many, many more that are beyond what's published in this textbook. For example, we have alpha-1 receptors that are found in smooth muscles, erector pili muscles, the uterus during pregnancy, and certain organs of the genitourinary system have alpha-1 receptors. Alpha-2 receptors are found in the preganglionic sympathetic neurons, pancreas, and adipose tissue. Okay. So binding to norepinephrine to alpha-2 receptors hyperpolarizes the preganglionic neuron and decreases sympathetic response. Okay. So the advantage of having different receptors is you can have different responses to the same neurotransmitters. Nature has made it kind of unique this way. Okay, so for example here's an example of the alpha-2 receptor of no norepinephrine. Okay, when alpha-2 receptors are not bound to norepinephrine, the preganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine, exciting the postganglionic neuron. Okay. However, when alpha-2 receptors bind norepinephrine, okay, so here's norepinephrine bound to the alpha-2 receptor, the preganglionic neuron hyperpolarizes, decreasing acetylcholine release and postganglionic neuron activity. And so the binding of the alpha-2 receptor here will decrease acetylcholine release. There are also different beta receptors too. Beta-1 receptors are located on the cardiac muscle and cells of the kidney and adipose tissue. Beta-2 receptors are located in the bronchial smooth muscles, skeletal muscle, urinary bladder, and smooth muscle blood vessels serving skeletal muscle. Okay. And again, the reason why having the different receptors is that you can get different responses using the same neurotransmitters. Beta-3 receptors are located in the adipose tissue and some muscles of the digestive tract. Okay, and the alpha and beta receptors, there's many, many more subtypes, but we won't go into those. Cholinergic receptors. We mentioned two of them, muscarinic and nicotinic receptors. Again, they're named by the toxins that are found to bind to them with high affinity. Muscarinic receptors bind muscarine and are found on sweat glands. Nicotinic receptors binds nicotine and are found on all postganglionic neurons with sympathetic ganglia and the adrenal medulla. Okay. Now we use some terminology, pharmacological terminology here. Agonists and antagonists. I think you probably could guess what they mean. Drugs that are agonists bind to the receptor and mimic effects of norepinephrine, for example. Drugs that are antagonists block the receptor and prevent norepinephrine from binding it, for example. So just producing norepinephrine as an example here. So let's look at the effects now on the sympathetic nervous system. And you have an idea for them. Okay? And so here are the effects of the sympathetic nervous system. So you think about what happens when someone's chasing you across campus. Okay? What's going to happen? Okay? Some of these you could predict. Okay? For example, you're going to have increase in heart rate and force of contraction. You're going to have dilation of bronchioles to get more air into your lungs. Okay. You're going to sweat more, so you're going to have an increase in secretion of sweat glands. You're going to have constriction of blood vessels, of the skin. You're going to have vasodilation to the blood vessels to the skeletal muscle, so that more blood goes to your skeletal muscles so you can run away. Okay, so this is one advantage of having different receptors on your blood vessels, because the blood vessels to the skeletal muscles can vasodilate, whereas the blood vessels to other parts of the body will be constricted. Okay. The digestive tract will be shutting down, so there's going to have vasoconstriction of the blood vessels of the digestive and urinary organs, because that's something you're interested in if someone's chasing you at the moment. Okay. Most of your digestive system will be inhibited. Okay. As well as decrease in secretion of the digestive glands. You're going to have an increase in glucose, so that can be used as an energy source. Okay. And the adrenal medulla is going to secrete more epinephrine, norepinephrine. Okay, so the ones, and also I forgot this first one is dilation of the pupil. So you're going to be more aware of your environment, and so more light is getting to your eye. So your pupils are going to dilate. Okay, the one that's kind of odd is the second one here. So cells of certain salivary glands increase in certain cells. So this is kind of the unusual one, which is hard to justify. Okay, but the rest of them, if you think about it, makes physiological sense. Now, we mentioned the adrenal medulla, so we're going to have a little discussion specifically on the adrenal medulla itself. Okay, so the adrenal medulla is essentially one large ganglion. Okay, it has inner adrenal medulla and an outer adrenal cortex. It has a preganglionic neuron going toward it, and it's essentially an endocrine organ because it secretes norepinephrine and epinephrine, but not to another neuron, but directly into the bloodstream. So that's why norepinephrine and epinephrine can act as neurotransmitters. And they can also act as a hormone. So we can see here the preganglionic neuron secretes acetylcholine. Okay, the acetylcholine binds to nicotinic receptors of the adrenal medulla cells. Okay, and then acetylcholine stimulates the medullary cells to release epinephrine, norepinephrine into the bloodstream. So it's like one giant ganglion, except it empties into the bloodstream rather than to another cell, which is kind of interesting. Okay, now let's look at the parasympathetic nervous system, which we describe as being rest and digest. Okay, and just to review a bit, it involves cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, and also sacral nerves S2 to S4. Okay, and the axons of the preganglionic neurons snaps with the postganglionic neurons at terminal ganglia near the target cells. Okay. So remember, they have a long preganglionic axon and a shorter postganglionic axon. You can see here that they exit the spinal cord at the spinal nerves, S2 to S4, but But the brain, it's being extending from these cranial nerves. Cranial nerve 3, which is the oculomotor nerve. Cranial nerve 7, the facial nerve. Cranial nerve 9, the glossopharyngeal nerve. And cranial nerve 10, the vagus nerve. Okay. Now, in the parasympathetic nervous system, both presynaptic and postsynaptic neurons secrete acetylcholine. So this is convenient if they're both the same. So now we're looking here at the figure of the parasympathetic fiber. And we can see here that the preganglionic axon secretes acetylcholine and binds nicotinic receptors. And the postganglion neuron also secretes acetylcholine. However, the target cells have muscarinic receptors. Okay, so you got to remember this. In the parasympathetic nervous system, the acetylcholine binds to nicotinic receptors on the postganglion neuron, and the postganglion neuron secretes acetylcholine, but muscarinic receptors on the target cells. Okay. Now, the cranial nerves that contribute to the parasympathetic nervous system form plexuses that innervate specific organs. Okay, and it controls most of the thoracic and most visceral of the thoracic and abdominal pelvic cavities. So we can see here that here oculomotor nerve is going to the eye, which we might expect. Facial nerve, okay, it's also going to the lacrimal gland and the salivary glands. Okay, the vagus nerve innervates many organs of the viscera of the thoracic and abdominal cavities, and then the pelvic nerves innervate the rectum and the urinary bladder. And so you can see here the vagus nerve innervates all the way to the kidneys as well. Okay. And so we can see the main effects of the parasympathetic nervous system. It's constricting the pupil, and adjusting for near vision. Because here, parasympathetic nervous system, you're not worried about the surroundings, but you're looking at your immediate attention in front of you. So you get constriction of the pupil. You have an increase in salivary gland secretions, okay, decrease in heart rate, bronchoconstriction, contraction of sphincters of the digestive tract and smooth muscle, increased secretions of the digestive tract, and relaxation of the sphincters. So, very opposite effects from the sympathetic nervous system. Let's look at the sacral nerves now. These control the last segment of the large intestine, the urinary bladder, and reproductive organs. And these pelvic splanchnic nerves, which we called before, form plexuses and synapses in the terminal ganglia. Okay, so here we can look at the effects of the both the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. Okay. Now, most of the functions of the autonomic nervous system have dual innervation, meaning that generally most organs have both innervations to the sympathetic nervous system and from the parasympathetic nervous system, and they're usually opposite in nature. This is what's called dual innervation, and it's probably common to most organs. However, not all organs have dual innervation. One example is the sweat glands, which are under control, sympathetic control. So when you're under stress or or someone's chasing you across campus, you're going to sweat more by your sympathetic nervous system. Okay. However, there's no innervation by the parasympathetic nervous system because decreased inhibiting sweating is not really it's not a favorable function of your body. So your sweat glands are one example that are not dually innervated, but most other organs are. Okay, so hopefully we provide you a greater insight of the autonomic nervous system now. Okay, and so this is the end of this lecture, number 10.